Welcome to our second panel. My name is Ron Haskins. I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and I also am affiliated with the Annie Casey Foundation. Welcome. I hope we can have some fascinating exchange here. The first thing I want to say is that we are going to focus in this panel especially on preparation of personnel. Teachers, of course, are the most frequent, but other personnel as well. So pediatricians, nurses who are involved in some of the home visiting programs, as I'm sure you all know. So we want to really focus as much as possible on how we should prepare personnel to populate the 0 through 8 system. A lot of people feel this is a special challenge for 0 to 8, that our thinking in the past has been 0 to 3, 3 to 5, K to grade 3, and we hope that we're not going to all think that way, that the panel would very much, the committee would very much like to write a report about integrating those various age groups and in the preparation of personnel to populate our various intervention programs. We're going to proceed. We're not going to have any formal talks. I'm going to pose some questions. The panelists all know the questions. And we're hoping to be a much more interactive panel than on the previous panel. So we very much would like you to talk to each other, challenge each other, get in arguments fine, so we can be both lively and informative. And we have a wonderful panel, so if they really get into it, I think we're going to learn. A lot. Let me just say one word about the panel members. Peter Mangione is the co-director of the Center for Child and Family Studies at Wested. Marcy Whitebook on my left, I'm sorry, I practiced before I got here and blew it. Whitebook is director of the Center for Study of Child Care Employment at UC Berkeley. And then Sharon Ritchie is the senior scientist from the Frank Porter Graham Center, and that's a wonderful place. I was there for about 20 years. So. And then Francis Rust is a senior fellow and director of teacher education programs at the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you very much. And Teri Talan is at the McCormick Center for Early Childhood Leadership and the National Louis University. So thank you as well. The panel members, in case you haven't figured this out, are primarily researchers and people who are directly involved in running programs for preparing primarily teachers. So I'm going to now pose the questions one at a time, and the panelists, I hope, will have a lively discussion. I'm not going to pick on somebody, so I'll pose the question. If you have something to say, wink at me, or Peter, you better not wink at me. Okay, how do things need to change to create a workforce that is prepared to operate in a more seamless birth through 8 system? So the workforce, as I told you, is the focus here. And how do we change how we currently do it so that it will be compatible with the 0 to 8 system? Marcy.
Okay. Well, I think that the first thing we have that would help. Yeah. Okay. The first thing we have to recognize is that there are very thick seams between in different ways. So between 0 to 3, 3 to 5, 5 to 8. There's also, we have sort of seams that are hard to break through among the disciplines. So we don't have a very interdisciplinary approach, and we don't really focus on the early childhood education side much on other roles other than teachers. So we have a lot of things that we have to do differently, but just taking the way we prepare, support, and reward teachers in early childhood and K through 12, you have really different personnel systems. And if you go down the list about preparation and qualifications, and is it pre-service or your preparation comes after, it's very, very different. And also, there's sometimes as many differences because of history and program expectations and funding sources among the 0 to 5 programs as there are between the 0 to 5 programs and the 5 to 8 program. So I think to think about getting seamless, you have to really start by thinking about the seams and thinking about those differences. And because what you have just around because the preparation's so different, you actually have the demographics of the workforce are actually very different. I'm just talking right now about early childhood teachers versus in the 0 to 5 versus the K through 3 arena. The other issue is that the supports that people get for ongoing learning are dramatically different for older children and younger children. The people working with younger children have less pre-service preparation and less on-the-job support, and they don't necessarily have, we don't have a system in place for pedagogical leaders, really, so to really help people on the job, and people don't get things like preparation time and all of, those kinds of things, professional sharing time. And then finally, and I'm sure we'll come back to this, is that when we get to the issue of reward, probably all of us would say that K through 3 teachers don't get maybe paid as much as they should. But what we're talking about with 0 to 5 teachers is something dramatically different. And even our most highly educated teachers in early childhood, which would be in the school, it would be, well, they're across the system, but those working in school-sponsored pre-K get the best salaries. They're only earning 75% on average of a kindergarten teacher who actually earns less than a first through 12th grade teacher. And that Head Start teachers with BAs are making like 59%. Childcare teachers who have BAs are making 50%, and it goes down. So we're now doing work looking at the poverty levels of people who are working in childcare and other early childhood settings. And we'll have data soon on this, but many of them are using federal income supports because they can't they can't live on their salaries. So I think we have to think about those differences when we go to thinking about being seamless, is that we have a lot of different issues to address. But we really need to have those differences in mind, and not, because I feel like sometimes what we're doing is we're pushing down the expectations we have for K through 3 teachers on early childhood teachers without creating a context for them that really supports them to meet those expectations.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm going to take the sort of the aerial view on teacher education itself. I think when we talk about the birth to 8 continuum, we have to think in a way about, and in a very specific way, about the adult side of professional preparation and what that continuum looks like. And I often refer to a timeline where if you started with somebody's childhood in their education and you finish with a teacher's the end of their career, you are talking about an enormous professional continuum in which the first part is what we learned in school and what we learned doing the apprenticeship of observation about how teachers teach. Teacher education itself becomes like a minute on that timeline. It is very small. So there are 2 things to think about here. One is what Malcolm Gladwell talks about in Outliers, the 10,000 hours for the development of expertise. I think in teacher ed we can grab 1,000 hours, at least in I right now work with graduate students in a 10-month program. It's like no time. So what I have to do is think about how to get them almost like dreaming about teaching. So that's where I get some of the 1,000 hours. And what I need to think about in positioning my program and the preparation of the teachers is the relationships that we develop with the field, because our students need to continue their education. And so I look at teacher education as being this continuum from pre-service right until the end in which the university program has to be involved. The other piece that I will just lay down here and then I'll come back to it later is that I often say to my students, most people don't remember before 3rd grade. And 3rd grade is when we sit, in rows and we watch teachers do the stuff they do. When you go into early childhood, we are asking for a huge shift. And the shift has to incorporate drawing on the funds of knowledge available among the children and families in the communities to which we go, and it has to go into our own tacit understandings of what a smart kid is, what a good kid is, how people work together. And this is enormous when you're doing something, even in a 4-year program, but certainly in a 10-month program like mine. So I urge you to think about that aerial view in order to get at the seams that you were talking about, Marcy.
Let's stick with this idea for just a minute about time. If it's 1,000 hours for teachers in your program, I'm sure we have lots of preschool teachers in the United States who have way less than 1,000 hours. In fact, we have a not inconsiderable number who have zero preparation. So the question here is, how much time do we need? And being realistic, especially for preschool teachers, I mean, we'd all like them to have a master's, but that's not going to happen tomorrow. So in the meantime, what suggestions do we have for how we can boost the qualifications of the workforce in the real world? I'm posing it to the panel. Peter, go ahead.
Partly my answer would be that we're not just talking about what happens in pre-service, that's a starting point for people, but as part of building this system, and I think there have been a lot of steps taken, we heard some this morning already, that you build a system in which there's the possibility for in-service and continuing development and continuous learning. And I think the other point that I heard this morning, which is important to keep in mind, is you start with a focus on practice right from the beginning of the higher education experience. I would like to pick up on Marcy's point about the seams, and I do think there are very tightly knit seams, but somehow we need to make them more permeable, that there are some common themes across birth to 8 that all adults working, all people in our workforce working with young children can focus on and need to learn about. But there's also going to be, the seams will be permeable. There also will be specialization. And the skills that it takes to be qualified and capable working with children in the birth to 3 age range in a group care context are skills that a K-3 teacher probably won't have. Likewise, that birth to 3 teacher won't have what the K-3 teacher has. But they are both positions that demand a lot of knowledge, a lot of skills, and a lot of practice to be effective.
But let me add, I don't want you to get away before you tell us about the first step of preparation. I'd like the panel to comment on what you see as a realistic way that we can prepare teachers in this 0 to 8 framework under current circumstances with the current financing, or what we should try to do if we improve in the future. For the first step, let's come back to in-service. Go ahead.
I go back to my own education, and when I really became serious about entering the field, I was a student at Merrill Palmer Institute in Detroit, and we were put right in the classroom, right from the beginning. And at the same time, we had classes that involved theory and research too, but we had to observe what was going in the classroom and understand what we were seeing from master teachers as good practice and start to connect that practice to the research we were learning about in our other classes.
One thing, so what we've heard from both panels, I want to make sure everybody agrees with this, that we should start people in the classroom as early as possible before they have all kinds of qualifications and so forth, at least as observers. Let's go ahead. Sharon.
I think that a very powerful experience, if we're going to get people in the classrooms right away, is to have them do it in partnership. I think there's something about coming away from observing or participating in classrooms when somebody has shared that experience with you, where right away you can grapple with it, you can talk about it, you can articulate practice, which is something I think that teachers do not get enough chance to do. And when you're in a constant partnership kind of situation, then you really do get to talk and think about what you have experienced. So I would recommend that.
Good, good. Marcy.
Well, and I think what we have to understand is that probably the majority of early childhood teachers actually get practice right from the get-go. Unfortunately, they're not getting it in partnership. They're not getting any time to talk to anybody about what they're doing. And if you ask teachers what is it they want, and this is true at all levels, they want professional sharing time. But you have so many people in early childhood who they go into a place and they just do what people are doing there. Nobody ever says it's good, bad, whatever. And then later on, when you're asking people to change practice, you have this whole new level of problem, which you're asking adults to say, gee, you've been doing it this way for 5, 10, whatever the number of years is. We'd like you to do it differently. And you have a whole different issue about, one, how do you get people to change habits? I mean, how good are we, any of us, at that? But also, it's a self-esteem issue because they're basically getting feedback that the way they've been doing it may not have been the right way. So we basically have, we initiate by practice for part of the 0 to 8 workforce with no sort of scaffolding around that. And then for other people, we give them lots of scaffolding before they actually get the practice. So we need to change that.
Teri.
I think we need to remember that a large number of the teaching workforce are working practitioners who then go to school. And so they are already in classrooms. They may not be necessarily in the best quality classrooms, but they're in the classrooms already. And so it becomes critical in my mind that there is this opportunity to work with a mentor or work with peers to really understand and put in context what they're learning in school and how that relates to the actual context of their work. This kind of relates to what was said on the last panel, and that is that oftentimes our teacher preparation programs are placing students in classrooms that don't look like the classrooms where the practitioners are working. And so the ability to essentially create win-win situations where working practitioners who are working towards degrees or working to specializations are able to really get that kind of internship, practicum experience with peer learning in classrooms serving the children that they work with is the critical piece. So it's so much more than just having an opportunity to work in a classroom in the first year. And then the other piece that I have to mention has to do with, well, the leadership of the programs where those teachers are working, and the idea that those teachers need opportunity to be reflective, to work with peers, to develop the kind of intentional teaching practices requires there to be leadership in the program that values it, structures time, scheduling, so that teaching practices can be developed in this intentional way. And we don't have that in our program leaders in the birth to 5 community. It is not built into an educational background for those program leaders. So I think that to talk about the teaching aspect of the workforce without looking at the seamless development of the program leaders is a problem. I have done research through our center looking at the relationship between the education of program leaders in birth to 5 programs, Head Start, as well as child care. And there is a distinct, significant relationship between the quality of those classrooms and the specialized education that program leaders have. And yet, we do not have systems across the country that really support that. So if we want a seamless system, birth through age 8, we're going to have to think about leaders as not just school leaders, principals and superintendents, but what do the leaders of Head Start programs and child care programs need to know and be able to do to support those teachers?
All right, I want to move on. Last very brief comment before we move to the next question. Go ahead.
Actually, I want to head us in a whole different way, and I'm going to do it. Because I think we have to think about seamlessness in a lot of different ways, and I want to talk about the approach to the importance of seamlessness across cultures that ensure that every child is helped to navigate differences that they encounter and early on recognize that they are important and competent members of an education community, and that simply isn't what's happening for us in our schools right now. I think we have to pay attention to the information on trajectories that let us know that early on that kids' notions of themselves and where they fit in school are stable and difficult to change. Great if you're doing well, not so great if you're not. The knowledge that we have that if one bad year is compounded by another, that many of our children do not recover. So how do we move to the development of learning environments that are not characterized by a culture of silence, by over-control and dominance, whole group and didactic instruction, and really look at the development across the 0 to 8, which ensures positive racial identity, self-efficacy, and kids who know that they're valuable learners.
Okay, very good. Well, there's a challenge, panelists. How many of you are going to get applause? Okay, next, assessment. The committee is extremely interested in assessment. How should we assess whether the teachers at all these levels or other personnel like home visitors and so forth, how can we assess that they're doing well, that they're effective at their job? Sharon, you want to go ahead?
Sure. I think that the first thing we need to ask is not so much what we're doing, but how we're doing it. We have been beating teachers up with data for so long that they cringe in fear at the very thought of being assessed or evaluated, and I think it takes changing from a mindset of evaluation to one of inquiry, where we use data to really help us think about how we're doing in classrooms, how we're affecting kids, to get really interested in it, to have it be the subject of collaborative conversation, to move from a place of a performance orientation, that I have to be better, that I have to be the best, that I have to get an A, to one of continuous improvement, where you're really thinking about how do I get better and how do I talk with my peers about getting better. That simply is not what's happening in our education environments right now. I'm not going to take up any more space because I think everybody else has great things to say, but I really do like the use of classroom observation measures as professional development. Particularly for elementary schools, the observation measures we have bring the elements, the constructs of quality into the elementary school. Elementary schools do not have a way of talking about quality, and they really need some ways of doing that.
Go ahead.
I couldn't do better than second that. It's absolutely, and the culture piece too. I think that one of the things we work very hard on in the programs with which I've worked is the notion of inquiry. Inquiry guiding your practice and being part of what teachers, part of the arsenal, if you will, or the toolkit that teachers have available to them. In a 4-year program, I was able to make that, just part of the way they breathed in the classroom. It is much harder in a master's program, as I said earlier. But I think formative assessment is a critical piece of that inquiry. And being able to develop this kind of work in settings where you come back and talk about what you've seen, so you begin to learn how to talk about teaching. I would love to see all of our teacher ed programs really in partnership in schools where we do these conversations right there in the classroom. When I was at NYU, I was lucky enough to have 18 student teachers in a school, so I could go and place 2 to a classroom and sit down with them together and have that conversation every single week. I think this has to be part of what we do. It's the way a learning community that really focuses on the way we're working with kids and even brings up problems of practice is a community that can reshape its practice.
Go ahead, Marcy.
Well, I think when we're talking about assessing teachers, I think what's so interesting about this is we very seldom have the teacher's voice in the discussion. And that we're talking about what teachers are doing. We're not ever asking teachers what it is they need to do their jobs well. And I think in some ways what we should be assessing in a lot of early childhood programs, and the K-3 literature about successful schools reflects some of this too, is whether or not the environment in which teachers are working is actually supporting them to apply what they know and get better at what they do. And so do they have the supports in place that they need, which in early childhood the issue of adequate staffing is one big support that people often don't have. Is there a learning community, which means more than just are you going to professional development, but is there professional sharing time? Is there do teachers have some autonomy to craft their jobs, to actually change what they're doing if they're learning new things and try it out? Do the program leaders actually give them feedback about their teachers and know how to be pedagogical leaders? And then finally, are we attending to the adult well-being? And that's economic, physical, and whether or not it's an equitable place to work and people feel respected. Because we're going in and we're doing these assessments for teachers, and you have teachers want to upping their ECHR scores or whatever it is, but we're really not looking at the fact that their teaching is collaborative and they're doing it with other people, and whether or not there's a learning environment for the teachers that allows them to develop and improve their practice.
Peter.
I've heard a lot that I completely agree with already, and just as we want to nurture in our teachers an open-minded inquiry and intentionality in their work through observing and learning from children and families, I think we want to create that kind of relationship with the teachers. So observation is essential, that their practice is being observed, but then there's a collaborative conversation about what it means, what the teacher's thinking about, and then reflectively and thoughtfully going forward about what do I do next. The other comment I wanted to make about this is I think we underestimate in these conversations what we're asking of teachers, because whenever you look at the competencies that have been developed by states have been asked to do that. The list is very long. Everything from being culturally competent, which is essential, understanding dual language learning, to developing responsive relationships, to knowing how to support early literacy and early numeracy. It's a wide, health concerns, it's a wide range of skills. And in order to do that in a way that helps people make progress, I think we have to make it a conversation and we have to make it a sharing and something we're working on together.
Very good. Answer this. Who's going to do it? Who is responsible for making sure the teachers are measuring them in some way and communicating with them? We've talked a lot here about the collegial relationship and so forth. Who does this?
Teri's probably going to expand on this. I think it's the leaders in the programs that we need to create mentoring relationships, and we need to create opportunities for teachers to grow to become mentors and those leaders. And I'm going to cede to Teri.
Yes, and I think that one of the dangers that we have, and I heard this too in the previous panel, is that we do that kind of instructional leadership externally, and that becomes a very expensive as well as burdensome model. We need to make sure that the leaders within the programs have the professional development to be those instructional leaders, to understand what teachers need, to be responsive, to provide that kind of support, feedback, and opportunity for peer learning that Marcy spoke to. And that's not going to happen unless we're intentional about preparing those program leaders to understand what's involved in instructional leadership. Leaders need to model intentional practice. They need to look at their own practices first in order to be able to make sure they're delivering this for the teaching workforce. Oftentimes, I'm surprised this hasn't come up, where the issue about whether we're looking for child outcomes is the measure of the effectiveness of teachers. And I think we all feel very strongly that we want the assessment of teaching to be formative, that it's not about the child outcomes, or maybe it's only partially about child outcomes, or how we think about child outcomes that's important. But I think that when I think about leaders and how do I know whether a leader is being effective in creating the kind of environment that supports effective teaching, I've thought a lot about that. And I think that it's really important that we look at the organizational culture of the program, of the school, the Head Start program, the child care program. And there are a number of tools available at this point to do that. We're not using what we have available to really look at organizational culture and climate. In addition, we look at the teaching practices, and again, we have good tools to look at teaching practices across the age span. And we look at family engagement and whether or not, and maybe this involves auditing parents and other family members, much in the way we need to look at the responses of teachers to understand the organizational climate. And so I think that by looking and assessing in those three areas, that's the way we're going to see the kind of outcomes that we want for children, mediated through the leadership of an early childhood program.
Sharon.
I'm going to use Francis's term of taking a more aerial view, and I think we need to think of our very smart colleagues who are doing implementation science, because I think in order to make the things that Peter and Teri are talking about possible, is you have to look at people who've really given thought to sustaining and capacity building, and in structured and very intentional ways of how do you get people in partnership to really think about those changes, bring the right people to the table, make sure that other people will follow up when those people disappear, because that is such a huge part of what we encounter. And so I urge us to really think about the work being done by those people.
Marcy.
And I think one of the, again, sort of stepping back, I think when you look at K through 3, there is more of an infrastructure around professional development and preparation, and that applies to administrators too, and coaches and induction programs. And then on the early childhood side, it's not just that we don't necessarily have people with those skills, but the higher ed programs actually do not have a leadership pipeline. We don't have programs in place to prepare mentors, prepare directors for the most part. I mean, there are a few examples. And so even in terms of how much we're focusing on mentoring and coaching these days, we're actually sending a lot of people out to mentor and coach who have never taught and have never been taught how to teach teachers to teach. And so, you know, on some level, and then the other issue we have is that our teacher-educator workforce is maybe a nice way to say it is my demographic. And so and there are a lot of people who got their training a really long time ago. They maybe have never worked with diverse groups of children. They maybe have never known the brain science. They actually are going to age out at some point. And we don't even have a pipeline for preparing new teacher educators, because early childhood related professional development often is coming without any pedagogical, the people who get the doctorates and master's degree oftentimes don't have any pedagogical experience or focus. So we have sort of a systems problem here around teacher education and leadership roles that actually has to be addressed.
I think people on the committee are assuming that when we focus on 0 through 8, and as this message gradually spreads, that the schools of education and other teacher preparation organizations are not going to run into the streets cheering and waving flags and saying, oh, we've waited for this, at last it's coming. What are the problems, the objections, the barriers that we should anticipate as we push forward on this 0 to 8 agenda, especially with regard to teacher preparation?
I'm going to tell a little bit of autobiography.
Pull the mic a little bit closer,
okay.
Will you please?
I came into teaching in the mid-'60s when people were trying to avoid the draft. And we had an incredible time of teaching then, and of thinking about what life could be like if really everybody got educated. We really believed we could change the world if we just got education under control, which of course we didn't. And, but a lot of us worked very hard and are still working at it. I think the thing that makes me saddest right now is I feel like I'm back there again. I feel like, as an early childhood person in the mid-60s, I got told, you know, it was like you didn't say you were doing early childhood because only nice little old ladies did that, right? And I wasn't. I was nice, but I wasn't a little old lady at that point. I am now. The idea is that anybody who's smart and has been well educated can teach. And we don't think even about specialization around early childhood. It is a given in this country right now that if you've had 4 years of college, you can teach anywhere. And this is something I think that is making our life incredibly difficult in the early childhood field, where the myth still persists that if you're nice, don't have to be old, but if you're nice, you can do this. It's just not that simple. But that is the press that we are working against. And I think that we can assess like crazy, but the issue is that we've got to convince the world that early childhood is really, really important. And so we can talk to one another about ways of assessing, and I'm delighted to do that. But I think that we have to talk beyond ourselves and reshape the conversation about what good early childhood looks like and how important it is to the future of our country.
Frances, you have had more experience, I think, than anybody on the panel probably in working in formal teacher education programs. Do you think that teacher education programs in American universities are they agreeing with the 0 to 8 focus? And if they're not, why not? And what do we say to convince them?
Well, it depends where you're teaching. At a place like the University of Pennsylvania, we couldn't possibly have an early childhood teacher ed program. It costs too much. So the issue of teacher preparation now has to devolve to community colleges and to what I can do as a teacher educator in a place like Penn is I can prepare those leaders who, by virtue of having a master's degree, are going to end up in leadership positions in the field. I must find ways of engaging them in the very settings in which they are going to be working and leading. But I also have to teach them the skills of interacting with other adults and enabling people to grab the responsibility. We talk about release of responsibility among children. The same thing has to happen among teachers, so creating the environments in which people can work together to raise the level of practice.
All right, so cost is one barrier. What's another one?
I'm going to speak to my specialization, which is birth to 3. I think a huge barrier is even if you get to the lower cost alternatives, such as community colleges, few have dedicated teachers, instructors in the infant toddler area. And in order to get there, and I think we have to get there, I think it's going to take time and investments, and I can imagine there would be barriers to that. And I think a plan will have to be put in place, and this is going to vary from state to state, place to place, because each state has its own culture of higher education and system, and so I can give you the broad outlines of what a plan might look like, but the specifics are going to have to be worked out. But I would look for milestones. How are we, first of all, building the capacity to teach it And then how are we then developing programs that are going to prepare people, infant, toddler, preschool, and K-3, and then in a coherent way, help them see that they're part of a profession that has a birth to 8 perspective.
Teri.
Well, I need to sort of disagree with Francis, and I don't like to do that. But in Illinois, I would say that I think that we're really making progress in this area, and we have a fair number of 4-year institutions that do offer early childhood degrees and that have specializations within their teacher preparation programs. I come from National Louis University, which began as National Teachers College, and has a 125-year history of really investing in teaching of early childhood teachers and leaders. So I think one of the things that I've seen in Illinois is that what's important is the development of a professional development system so that there's real deliberate work to integrate the work of the community colleges with 4-year institutions involving articulation and the development of specialized credentials that articulate from a training level to a training competency level to a 2-year degree to a 4-year degree. And we have seen that in Illinois, and it's growing. We have a large number of entitled institutions, 2-year and 4-year, located throughout our state, and our state is pretty large, that are really able to address the competencies that have been identified through our career development system. We have an infant toddler credential that is built on top of our early childhood education credential. So it's understanding that you have core knowledge that stakeholders throughout the state have came together to define and describe, and that core knowledge is built on and represented in all of the credentials in our system. So the infant toddler credential certainly has competencies that are specific to the birth to 3, but it doesn't ignore the birth to 5 and even the birth to 8.
Teri, do you think that the way you're doing it now is compatible with within a 0 to 8 framework?
Absolutely.
And are there changes you have to make?
Yes, absolutely. And one of the changes that we've seen, policy changes in our state, one of which has been the redesign of the licensure, teacher licensure. So the early childhood licensure is a birth through 2nd grade. And we lost 3rd grade to early childhood licensure, but what we did gain was understanding that kindergarten teachers are wholly to be prepared in under this early childhood license.
Marcy.
And so the important piece here is that we have a continuum, and the same thing with our principal preparation has been changed to require principals to be trained P through 12 and require content in early childhood as well, and really critical piece, field experiences in early childhood settings. All new principals prepared in Illinois have that.
Thank you. Marcy.
So I think I think policy does have a lot to do it, and when the state develops policies that can drive what higher ed does. We've been doing early childhood inventories. We've now done them in 4 states, where you actually get a baseline description of the course offerings, stuff about the practicum and the faculty, but looking at it by age level. So, and that gives states a way to say, oh, we have courses around these things for children who are 3 to 5 or 5 to 8, but we don't have 0 to 2. We have people in the state get a description of what their early childhood higher ed offerings look like, and then that's a starting point for bringing people together to come up with some kind of state policy that will drive change, and we're seeing that happening in the states that have done it. So I think it's sort of a combination of evidence, bringing people together, bringing stakeholders together, and doing policy. And I wanted to say one other thing I was trying to say before about the practicum. across the board, the field placements of practica, it's kind of location, location, location is how people choose where people are working, you know, in what their applied experiences are. Most of the applied experiences are in the 5 to 8 range, not in the 0 to 5, because you have either the programs aren't oriented that way or people are already working full time and it's really hard to figure out how to do some kind of supervised practica, student teaching. So I think the institutions of higher education are aware of those problems. I think it's more how you engage them in conversation and you think about what are resources needed to do some of these things, because as I think you were alluding to, Francis, the early childhood section of most education departments or other departments they're in is always the least resource program in the institution. So having external resources and policy can help drive change on the early childhood side.
I think my students often laugh because I struggle a lot with the high-tech stuff in my classroom, and yet I'm considered a real techie at Penn. So it's funny. But one of the things that I think we need to start using is what's available to us through the internet. And I think often tell about the work that Ron Lally does at West Ed. I remember about 4 years ago at one of the summer NAEYC conferences, he showed us how he works to teach teachers around the state about almost like core behaviors that children can show, and teach teachers how to recognize them. And I'll never forget his showing a video of empathy. He had no words on it. He showed a 3-month-old, a 6-month-old, 12-month, 18-month, 24-month, 36-month. Showed children showing empathy. The 3-month-old oriented its head towards another crying child. The 6-month-old crawled to a child. I'm going to tell you, when those teachers finished watching that video, they could start identifying empathy in their classroom. And we get stuck in teacher ed on the notion that we have to place them in certain places. The fact is, they have to get the gestalt for what a good environment looks like and how to recognize the behaviors that we're looking for from children and how to nurture them. So seeing people doing it.
Sharon.
Although I'm pleased to hear that Illinois is making headway in having kindergarten teachers be more oriented towards early childhood, I surely do not think that's the norm. And we have children who, it's on their backs, fall off a cliff as they move from programs that support choice and autonomy and self-regulation into ones that expect children to sit for 2 and 3 hours in whole group settings with teachers who believe that kids raising their hands and answering one right answer questions.
Don't forget stand in line.
I will never forget stand in line and crisscross applesauce and all of the other things that we do, which, you know, and who gets in trouble for breaking those rules are our minority boys. And what message do they get about how fun school is? Turn your card. No ice cream party for you. I'm going to call your grandmother. These endless microaggressions that happen to kids because we haven't helped teachers know about the kinds of supports that young children need and really address that huge gap that happens between pre-K and K.
On this panel and the first panel, parents came up several times. I think it's universally accepted parents are crucial to kids' education and that there's a role for parents in our preschool programs and early elementary years. So here's what I'd like to know. What should the committee say about the preparation and the assessment of teachers regarding their ability to work with parents?
I'll refer to Penn because it's the only place I've seen this since my own training. Our students come in the summer, they start July 1. We're unless that happens on a Saturday, we're pretty tough about it. So they spend the entire summer in the environments in which they're going to be teaching in the fall, but not in schools. So they are spending the summer in the neighborhoods, working sometimes with a bike program, or they'll work in an Upward Bound program, or in a park program or something like that. They know the neighborhood by the time they walk into those schools, and they have spent 6 weeks interacting with parents, grandparents, aunts and uncles, brothers and sisters, so that when they arrive in the classroom as the student teacher, they know that community. It's a beginning. It's not as good as what Louise Mahl does at the University of Arizona. I wish I could do that. But it is an immersion in the community. I have found very few programs that invite and teach their students how to do home visits, which was part of my own training. Every child I ever taught at a preschool level, I saw at home. And it didn't matter whether it was the 4th floor walk-up in New York City or something out in Westchester County, New York. The fact was, I knew where each of those children lived, and often it was so important to them that I'd been there.
Other suggestions? Yeah, go ahead.
I think what we have to nurture in teachers and leaders is an ability to collaborate with families in an authentic way. That, especially if we think about young children, and I'm thinking about very young children, the family is essential, and the child is not only learning language, but is also learning how to communicate in this family. The child is learning the rules of the road, how to get along in life, what we value, what we believe in. And that is in the family that happens, and that's where it should happen. And so it's a matter of, when we're talking about supporting learning and supporting early development, of coming together with families and learning from them as we share with them our knowledge and wisdom about young children too, and that we plan together, we reflect together on the learning we're seeing, and then decide how we're going to support those children in a way that keeps those children connected with their families and communities. The second point you asked about assessment, I think in the sense of formative assessment, we need to develop ways to hear from families how it's working for them. And I don't know exactly what that would look like, but I think we would want to do that.
Other comments on the panel? Let me ask you another question. People have mentioned several times, and I think it's a fairly new, last decade or so, a lot of coaching, new roles for supervisors and so forth. Let's talk specifically about supervisors. What role does training play, either in universities or in-service training, to have good supervisors that can work with teachers or coach teachers or help teachers in what they're doing in the classroom? What should we be doing there? What would our recommendations be there? Good supervision, helpful supervision, and so forth. I stumped the panel.
Well, I'll start, because I think the assumption has been, and we're flying as we're building the plane in our field. And so who becomes a good coach? It was someone who was a good teacher. Who becomes the leader and supervisor? It's someone who was effective and successful in the other role. And I do think there are some models for preparing people to do that work, but we need a lot more of that kind of effort.
Go ahead, Teri.
I think that one of the things you start seeing in state professional development systems is the development of a credential that sometimes is called a relationship-based professional development credential or a coaching credential. And in the best of worlds, those credentials are being developed collaboratively through those that are working with children all the way across the learning continuum of birth through age 8, and identifying what are the competencies that need to be present in order to be the most effective as a change leader and helping people develop most fully in their teaching role. And I think that what you then will see is coursework being developed, if it isn't already, in order to support and deliver on those competencies. But again, I think this is an area where sometimes I think the professional development systems in early childhood that are outside of the PK world are leading the way in thinking about having a cross-sector system for professional development for those coaches.
Marcy.
Oh, okay. I think that Francis said the idea that teachers need to be articulate about what they're doing. And I think people who are coaching and mentoring actually have to be articulate practitioners who can, it's one, think about a cooking show. Like, I might be a really good cook, but that doesn't mean I can go on TV and show other people how to do it. And I think that's true of teaching as well. So sometimes we just say someone who's a good teacher, we automatically make them a coach, but they may actually not know how to teach adults, how to change their practice. And more often than not, we see a lot of people who don't want to be classroom teachers because of the jobs. They take on teaching and coaching jobs, but actually haven't taught. So I think we really have sort of abandoned, or maybe not abandoned, but not yet grasped, and how seriously we need to think about the preparation of our coaches, and I think, and mentors. And I think it's one that they actually need to know what good teaching is, and know what they know how to do, what they don't know how to do, what they know how to articulate, and be able to explain to somebody else. I think they also need to understand the environment in which they're going into, and what that means, the nature of the coaching program or the mentoring program, and what that means for their relationship with their protege. Because in some places people are choosing to work with a coach or work with a mentor, and they're engaging in some kind of mutual decision about what they're learning. Other times it's very prescribed. So you have these situations where oftentimes people who don't have much experience teaching themselves, coming in and teaching someone who's been teaching for 20 years how to teach. And there's a lot of issues there about navigating the adult relationships between the protege and the mentor that we need to think about. And then the other issue is that we really need mentors and coaches to have their eye to whether or not the organization in which they're working is actually supporting teachers. We're spending a lot of money sending people in, having them work with one individual teacher, and they have to think about when they leave, is that teacher really going to be able to continue that? Or in fact, is that teacher going to see there's another way to teach? I'm out of here and I'm going to go someplace else. So I think really as we move into the relationship-based professional development, which I think is a wonderful, development, I think we have to be much more rigorous and not take our usual, oh, it's early childhood, anybody can do it, approach to these roles.
Sharon.
Being a little specific about some of the things that Marcy addressed is, I think, thinking about the relationship between our mentor teachers and our student teachers as more of a reciprocal relationship. Because I think that novice teachers are bringing passion, they're bringing the latest research, they're bringing innovation and energy, and that can really have a large impact on a mentor teacher who isn't viewing them as an empty vessel in which to throw all of their knowledge. At the same time, of course, the relationship already exists in terms of a novice learning from a mentor, but again, not in that way of how do we truly work together to use our strengths to be better at what we're doing.
Peter.
When Ron, Lally, and I developed the program for infant toddler care, we thought at first what we were developing was a professional development system that would show teachers how to develop those responsive relationships with children and families and be effective. After about 3 years of our materials being out in the field and people being very excited about them, what we kept hearing over and over again from all over the country, actually different parts of the world, is you need to focus on how adults can work with adults around these materials. And I would say half of our work now is dedicated to that part of it.
Right, before we open it up for questions, I would like to go right down, starting with Peter and coming down the panel. I would like you to tell the committee, in our section when we talk about preparation of teachers, and other personnel for 0 to 8, keeping in mind the 0 to 8 framework, what's the one thing that you think we better not leave out? This you must cover, and it can be as specific as you want it to be. Peter.
I would say you need to become effective at developing relationships, collaborative relationships with the people you're servicing, with the children and families. You have to be aware of their languages, you have to be aware of their cultures, and you have to know how to connect with them. Above all else, we have to help people do that.
Teri.
Well, I am going to focus on leaders, and I would say that leadership needs to look at a learning continuum across the board, and that it's important that our principal preparation programs begin at birth, and that our early childhood preparation programs for Head Start and child care, leaders need that learning continuum. Even if they're working in early Head Start, that's just birth to 3, they need that learning continuum at least through birth through age 8. And I would urge, again, the relationships among adults, that leaders need to understand how to lead change processes, but how to motivate others, because their primary work is to support the teachers in the classroom. And so working on a relationship-based reflective practices is what I think is critical for preparing leaders.
Sharon.
I think brain research, developmental science is absolutely key to the huge changes that we can anticipate in the next 10 years. We need a workforce who truly understands how memory works, the function of attachment, executive function, the importance of fresh air and exercise in terms of making the brain actually function at its highest. I think we could turn around education in its entirety with a strong workforce in brain development.
Wow, I want to do that. Let's do it. I don't know what to add to what's already been said. I think that the one thing I could wish for is that the people who are doing the research find ways to bring it into practice. And I think we can do it through our students, but I also think that we have to develop really serious partnerships with the places where our students will go. I once was looking for a deanship and suggested to the school that was interviewing me that I asked them, how does this community talk about you? Do they call you our teacher education institution? Because that's what we need. If you look at the research, the MetLife studies on teaching, every community likes its own school. It's all the others that are bad. If we're going to have this research come into practice and really do the whole professional development continuum, the communities that we serve have to call us their schools.
Marcy.
I suspect that most of us on this panel won't be here 20 years from now, or certainly not on this panel, and hopefully, so I think we need to think 20 years out. And all of us have had the experience of being in early childhood in 2 different centuries, and we've made 20th, 21st, and we've made just to be clear here.
That was not necessary.
And the 21st century, I think we've witnessed really a phenomenal change in public awareness about what's happening with young children, how important the early years are, and how important early childhood services are. And I think we're only going to continue to do that as we learn more and more from the brain research and other things we're doing. But I think our conception of working with young children is generously, I'll say 20th century, but maybe closer to 19th. And we still, I think most Americans, when they think of teachers, do not think of someone with a 4-year-old or a younger child. And they would be hard-pressed to think that people who are working with younger children need the knowledge and skills of people working with older children. And if we don't change that, then I think 20 years from now, we're going to be doing this again and dealing with a lot of the same issues. Linked to that is that almost any young person getting out of college right now, who maybe is learning about the brain research, rightfully looks at jobs in early childhood, with very few exceptions, as a pathway to poverty. And they are absolutely right. And most of the people who are in early childhood now are going to get out if they can, because even a lot of the people we're sending back to school are still living in poverty. And so we really have to think about the early childhood jobs, and we can get the best preparation system in the world, but if we don't have organizations and a funding source that can actually support these to be, middle-class jobs that people can become professionals over decades and really learn to do the work well, I say as someone who, you were talking about the 60s, well, I came of age then too, and I thought, well, I didn't really start teaching until the 70s, but anyway, but I thought, was like, well, I want to be a nursery school teacher, I want to do this, and I was like, I'm never going to be able to make a living doing this, and so I thought, well, I'll fix that, because we were fixing a lot of things in those days, and I thought it would be quick, and here I am, and, and I have a sister who's been a child care teacher this whole time, and let me tell you, I got out of the classroom, and I have a retirement, I have a lot of things. My sister doesn't, and, I kind of look at her and think, well, what have I done? What have we accomplished? So I think we really do need to say this question of these jobs is a question about how we fund these resources, and I think we're all very, very outraged about child poverty, but I think we're resigned to poverty among our workforce, and until that changes, we're in bad shape.